If you think the Terracotta Army was built to guard one dead emperor, you are looking at the site too narrowly. What Albert Lin's scans help reveal is something far more unsettling and far more impressive. The warriors are not standing in front of a single tomb like decorative bodyguards outside a royal coffin. They are part of a vast, engineered landscape, a buried political world, a physical map of imperial power built to survive death itself. And once you understand that, the real question changes. The Terracotta Army is not simply guarding a man. It is guarding an entire idea of rulership that Qin Shi Huang wanted to carry beyond the grave. Most people know the famous image. Long rows of clay soldiers, life-size, armed, disciplined, facing outward in formation. It is one of the most recognizable archaeological discoveries on Earth. But the famous pits are only one fragment of the larger mausoleum of China's first emperor. The full site is enormous. UNESCO describes the mausoleum area as a property of more than 56 square kilometers, with over 600 associated sites, including nearly 200 accompanying pits, burial areas, architectural remains, bronze chariots, horses, and thousands of terracotta figures. And that alone changes the scale of the story. This is not a tomb with a remarkable side chamber. It is an entire funerary complex built on the scale of a political universe. That larger perspective is exactly where Albert Lin's work becomes so important. In the National Geographic investigation of the first emperor's burial complex, Lin did not approach the site as a tourist attraction or even as a simple excavation zone. He and the teams working around the mausoleum used surveying drones, core sampling, ground-penetrating radar, and remote sensing to study what lies across and beneath this massive landscape. Those methods do not magically reveal every detail underground, and they do not justify every dramatic claim made online, but they do show something crucial. The Terracotta Army sits inside a much bigger design. The clay soldiers that fascinate the world are not the whole secret. They are a visible edge of a burial system whose true scale only becomes clear when the site is mapped as a whole. And that bigger design matters because Qin Shi Huang was not buried as a private individual. He was buried as the ruler who unified rival states into the first centralized Chinese empire in 221 BCE. Ancient sources describe him as a monarch obsessed with order, power, permanence, and control. The mausoleum reflects exactly that. Smart History notes that the complex appears to replicate the buildings, geography, possessions, and even the inhabitants of the Qin Empire. UNESCO likewise describes the entire layout as echoing the urban plan of the Qin capital, with the imperial palace conceptually enclosed and protected inside layers of walls and associated structures. In other words, the emperor was not simply given an afterlife escort, he was given a reconstructed state. That is why the warriors should never be read in isolation. They are extraordinary works of art, but they are also administrative components in a larger machine of burial symbolism. The army pits are east of the emperor's main mound, and UNESCO notes that the army faces outward from the Tiom. That positioning is often interpreted in relation to the enemies the emperor once confronted during his lifetime. Even in death, the arrangement suggests vigilance, orientation, and military purpose. The warriors are not random decorative figures. They are a spatial argument. They say that imperial authority continues, that the emperor's reach continues, and that the world below is meant to remain secure. The soldiers themselves reinforce that impression. Viewers often hear that there are 8,000 warriors, and that number has become shorthand for the whole site. But what is often lost is how carefully the army was organized. Smart History explains that the known army pits contain infantry, cavalry, chariots, horses, officers, and command structures arranged in deliberate formations. Pit 1 is dominated by infantry. Pit 2 includes multiple sections with chariots, cavalry, archers, and other troops. Pit 3 appears to function as a command post. This is not just a crowd of statues. It is an army diagrammed in earth. At the same time, the modern museum view can mislead us. Smart History makes an important point that should change how every documentary tells this story. The panoramic view visitors see today, with the roof removed and the pit open to observation, is a modern curated perspective, not an original ancient experience. The emperor, the builders, and the people buried here would never have seen the army exactly as we see it now. That matters because it reminds us that the mausoleum was not built for public display. It was built to be sealed, unsealed, and operational within a ritual and political logic that belonged underground. The Terracotta Army looks like a spectacle to us because the ground was broken open. In its original context, it was part of a closed system. That sealed quality is one reason the central tomb of Qin Shi Huang remains unopened. Beneath the main mound lies the burial chamber of the emperor, but modern archaeologists have not excavated it. Smart History states clearly that the chamber has not yet been opened primarily because of concern over preserving what may be inside. That caution is not academic hesitation for its own sake. Archaeologists already learned a painful lesson from the warriors themselves. When excavated, many figures lost their original painted surfaces almost immediately, as exposure triggered rapid deterioration. Smart History notes that the soldiers were once brightly colored with pigments, including malachite, cinnabar, azurite, and Han purple, and that much of this paint dissolved soon after excavation. If that kind of damage can happen to exposed figures, the stakes for the unopened central chamber are even higher. This is where one of the most famous ancient descriptions enters the story. The historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after the first emperor's death, described a burial chamber containing a model of the empire with rivers and seas represented in Mercury and heavenly bodies represented above. His account is one of the reasons the site has captured imaginations for generations. But Smart History also warns that Sima Qian must be read carefully because he wrote under a later dynasty and consistently portrayed the first emperor as tyrannical and excessive. So the ancient text cannot simply be treated like a modern excavation report. It is a historical source, valuable but interested. What makes the story so compelling is that modern science has not dismissed that ancient account entirely. Albert Lin's investigation highlights elevated mercury concentrations around the main mound, and the documentary frames those readings as consistent with ancient reports of liquid mercury within the tomb environment. The video explicitly describes the mound as riddled with high concentrations of mercury, consistent with the idea of rivers of liquid metal below. That is not proof that every detail of Sima Qian's description is literally correct, but it is enough to keep the ancient account alive as more than pure fantasy. Some parts of the old story may preserve real information, and that is one of the most fascinating things about Albert Lin's scans. They do not simply make the site more mysterious, they sharpen the boundary between what we can say, what we can strongly suspect, and what remains uncertain. Online retellings often flatten that distinction. A theory becomes a fact, a possibility becomes a discovery. A reconstruction becomes a headline. But the real story is more disciplined and in some ways more impressive. Remote sensing has helped reveal the breadth of the burial landscape, the organization of its subsidiary features, and the likelihood that major parts of the central tomb remain intact. What it has not done is give us a complete cinematic reveal of every chamber and every secret. The power of the evidence lies in how much it suggests, while still leaving important questions unresolved. That larger burial landscape includes far more than soldiers. Smart History describes pits associated with civil officials, entertainers, strongmen, birds, stables, and other elements of imperial life. The mausoleum was not just protected by an army. It was populated by a reconstructed court and a reassembled world. This is the point at which the title question becomes clearer. What is the Terracotta Army really guarding? Not just an emperor's body, not just treasure. It is guarding access to an entire underground version of rulership, an empire converted into funerary form. The soldiers are one defensive layer in a wider symbolic order that includes bureaucracy, animals, vehicles, architecture, ritual, and cosmic imagery. That helps explain why the site feels so modern in one sense. The mausoleum is an act of statecraft in physical form. Qin Shi Huang unified writing, weights, measures, and political authority across large territories. UNESCO emphasizes that the site is inseparable from that first unification under a centralized state. His burial complex extends that same logic into death. The empire above ground was standardized, ordered, and brought under one ruler. The empire below ground was built to preserve that order after his death. The mausoleum is not merely memorial architecture. It is governance projected into eternity. Of course, no honest script can discuss Qin Shi Huang's tomb without also discussing the cost. Ancient accounts claim that vast numbers of laborers worked on the mausoleum. UNESCO summarizes Sima Qian's report that workers from every province of the empire toiled on the subterranean city until the emperor's death in 210 BCE. The National Geographic material surrounding Albert Lin's investigation repeatedly treats the complex as a place where the line between monument and human suffering is impossible to ignore. But here, precision matters. There's evidence of human burials connected to the mausoleum complex, and there are archaeological studies of people associated with construction and service there. What responsible research does not justify is making sweeping claim, lest that every dramatic rumor is settled beyond debate. The site absolutely speaks to coercion, imperial power, and death. But the details must be handled carefully, because the difference between evidence and embellishment is exactly what separates documentary writing from viral mythology. Albert Lin's documentary does present some disturbing material from the broader complex, including human remains, skull analysis, and signs of violent death connected to high-status burials and other graves. It also raises questions about court politics after the emperor's death, including succession violence and the killing of people linked to the imperial household. Those are important themes, and some are supported by archaeology and by ancient textual traditions. But the key takeaway is not that one scan suddenly exposed a single hidden horror beneath the army. It is that new technology helps place the mausoleum within a larger network of burial practices, political control, and historical evidence that was always bigger than the famous pits alone. That is also why the most sensational online version of the story is ultimately less interesting than the real one. Saying the Terracotta Army hides a monster, a curse, or a simple twist ending reduces the site to entertainment. The actual archaeological picture is grander. Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum appears to be a deliberate total environment. It combines military, Ria, dynasty, court ritual, artistry, engineering, cosmology, and political messaging. It contains realistic human figures on a scale unprecedented in earlier Chinese burial art. Yet even there, scholars urge caution. Smart History notes that although the figures look individualized, they may not be portraits of actual specific soldiers. Instead, they were mass-produced from standardized elements and then varied to create lifelike different. NCS. That detail matters because it mirrors the entire empire the emperor built. Standardized at the base, differentiated at the surface, and controlled from the center. Even the artistry supports that interpretation. The warriors were not rough, symbolic placeholders. They were equipped with carefully modeled armor, hairstyles, and rank markers. Weapons recovered from the site demonstrate the technical sophistication of Qin military production, and Albert Lin's documentary points to the continuing sharpness and effectiveness of Yomi bronze weapons. UNESCO stresses that the documentary value of the figures and objects is enormous because they preserve military organization, craft methods, and material culture from the late Warring States and Qin period. So the army is not merely guarding something. It is itself part of the guarded message. It displays the military and administrative order on which the emperor's authority rested. And then there is the unresolved question of what still lies in the sealed core. That is the part of the story that keeps pulling people back. Not because archaeologists are unaware of the tomb, but because opening it today could destroy what it pres RVs. The damage to painted surfaces in previously excavated areas is already a warning. The mercury issue raises further concerns. And once a sealed environment is breached, irreversible chemical and physical changes begin immediately. And that means restraint is not failure. It is a conscious decision to protect information that future conservation methods may recover more safely than current ones can. So when people say Albert Lin's scans exposed what the Terracotta Army is really guarding, the most accurate answer is this. They helped show that the warriors are guarding not just one tomb, but a monumental buried state. Thought. A. Stand at the edge of a funerary landscape built to preserve imperial order, replicate the emperor's domain, and shield an unopened center whose contents may still echo ancient written accounts. They guard a political vision turned into earthworks, sculpture, walls, pits, and ritual space. They guard the boundary between what has been excavated and what remains intentionally sealed. And they guard one of the clearest material statements ever made by an ancient ruler that power should not end at death. There is another reason this matters. The Terracotta Army has often been isolated from the emperor himself, admired as art without being fully connected to the political system that produced it. But once you return it to that system, the site changes character. It becomes more than an archaeological wonder. It becomes evidence of how early empires imagined permanence. Qin Shi Huang did not merely want to be remembered. He wanted this realm reconstructed around him. He wanted armies, officials, vehicles, animals, and symbols of cosmic order placed into a durable underground arrangement. The mausoleum is not just about fear of death. It is about refusal to surrender command. That may be why the site continues to feel so modern. The technologies used to study it are modern, but the underlying human impulse is familiar. How does a ruler preserve power beyond a lifetime? How does a state make itself appear permanent? How do monuments turn politics into memory? At the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, those questions were answered with staggering literalness. Build the world again, bury it, arm it, seal it. Let future generations understand that even death does not dissolve authority without a fight. And yet, for all the emperor's ambition, the site also contains the limits of power. The central chamber remains closed, the full contents remain unknown, ancient texts still have to be weighed against material evidence, remote sensing can map, suggest, and strengthen hypotheses, but it cannot replace excavation or erase uncertainty. That balance between revelate, ion, and restraint is what makes the mausoleum one of archaeology's greatest unfinished stories. The mystery survives, not because nothing is known, but because so much is known just clearly enough to show how much still lies beyond reach. So no, the Terracotta Army is not simply guarding the emperor in the narrow way popular retellings suggest. It is guarding a buried imperial system, a reconstructed empire, a sealed historical argument about power, death, and control. Albert Lin's scans did not uncover a fantasy ending. They did something better. They helped bring the entire scale of the first emperor's world back into view. And once that world comes into focus, the clay soldiers stop looking like the whole story. They start looking like the gate. Most people think the Terracotta Army was built to protect one dead emperor. But the deeper archaeologists study the site, the clearer it becomes that these famous clay soldiers were never meant to guard only a body. They stand at the edge of something far larger, far more deliberate, and far more unsettling. An entire buried world built to preserve imperial power after death. And when Albert Lin's scans helped map more of the landscape around China's first emperor, they reinforced a truth that changes the whole story. The Terracotta Army is not simply guarding Qin Shi Huang. It is guarding the remains of a complete underground empire. That shift in perspective matters, because the Terracotta Army is usually shown as if it is the whole site. It is not. The soldiers are only one part of a massive mausoleum complex created for the first emperor of a unified China. Qin Shi Huang conquered rival states and brought them under one centralized rule in the 3rd century BCE. He standardized writing, weights, measures, and administration across his empire. In life, he built a political order designed to control the world above ground. In death, he appears to have tried to recreate that same order below it. That is why the scale of the mausoleum is so important. The famous warrior pits are extraordinary, but they are only one element within a much larger funerary landscape filled with burial pits, tombs, ritual spaces, structures, chariots, animals, and human made representations of court life. The clay soldiers are the most famous discovery because they are visually overwhelming, but they were never meant to stand alone. They were placed within a broader design that mirrored the emperor's empire itself. Albert Lin's work helped bring that bigger design into sharper focus. Using tools such as surveying drones, remote sensing, core sampling, and ground-penetrating radar, he examined the site as a landscape rather than just a tourist icon. That is the key to understanding what the scans really revealed. They did not suddenly open the tomb or expose every secret beneath it. What they did was something more valuable. They showed that the Terracotta Army belongs to an immense planned complex whose true meaning only becomes visible when you stop looking at the soldiers as isolated statues and start seeing them as one defensive layer in a carefully arranged imperial system. And that system was built with astonishing precision. The warriors are arranged in battle formation, divided by corridors and embankments with different pits serving different military roles. Some areas contain infantry, others include cavalry, chari, OTS, horses, and command structures. Even their orientation matters. The army faces outward from the tomb, toward the east, the direction associated with the lands the emperor once confronted and conquered. This was not decoration. It was military order translated into burial form. Even in death, the emperor was surrounded not by passive symbols, but by an organized force still positioned for control. What makes the figures even more remarkable is that they combine mass production with individuality. Up close, each soldier appears unique, with different armor details, hairstyles, expressions, and rank markers. But archaeologists have shown that these figures were made through a highly organized workshop system using molds for separate body parts, which were then assembled and refined by hand. In other words, the army looks personal, but it was built through imperial standardization. That detail feels symbolic in itself. Qin Shi Huang's empire was also built through standardization, discipline, and central control. The warriors reflect the same governing logic as the state they served. The deeper mystery lies beneath the central mound, where the emperor's burial chamber still remains unopened. For generations, this sealed tomb has fueled legends about hidden chambers, treasures, traps, and rivers of mercury. Some of those stories come from the ancient historian Sima Qian, who described a burial chamber containing a model of the empire, with mercury representing rivers and seas and heavenly bodies represented above. For a long time, many people treated that description as exaggerated or symbolic. But modern scientific readings around the mound have found unusually elevated mercury levels in the soil, which suggests that at least part of the old account may preserve real information. That does not mean every dramatic claim is proven. And that distinction matters. One of the biggest problems with sensational retellings of the Terracotta Army is that they blur the line between evidence, theory, and imagination. Albert Lin's Xi'an did not prove every rumor ever told about the tomb. They did not reveal some neat cinematic twist hiding beneath the warriors. What they did reveal is more interesting than fiction. They supported the idea that the emperor's burial was conceived on a scale far beyond a single chamber, and they strengthened the view that the central mound may still protect a largely intact and highly complex funerary environment. That is why archaeologists have chosen not to open the main chamber. It is not because they are uninterested, it is because excavation can destroy as much as it reveals. When the terracotta warriors were first uncovered, many still carried traces of vivid original paint, but once exposed to air, much of that color began to flake and disappear almost immediately. If painted surfaces, wooden structures, textiles, or other fragile materials survive inside the central tomb, opening it too soon could erase priceless evidence before it can be properly preserved. In that sense, the emperor's final defense may not be only mercury or architecture, but time itself. And this is where the meaning of the army changes. The Terracotta Army is not just guarding a corpse, it is guarding a sealed political vision. Beneath the earth lies a ruler's attempt to make power permanent, to rebuild his empire in symbolic form, and to carry command into the afterlife. The soldiers, the horses, the chariots, the surrounding pits, and the unopened mound all belong to one idea, that the emperor's authority should continue, unbroken, even after death. So when people ask what Albert Lin's scans exposed, the answer is not that they uncovered a monster, a curse, or some single hidden object more important than everything else. They exposed the scale of the design. They reminded us that the warriors are not the secret. They are the gate. What they are really guarding is a buried empire, a perfectly ordered vision of power sealed beneath the Archaeological, on for more than 2,000 years. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. The first emperor did not want to be remembered as a man who died. He wanted to remain a ruler forever. If this changed the way you see the Terracotta Army, leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more deeply researched stories that uncover the truth behind history's greatest mysteries. If this changes the way you see the Terracotta Army, leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more deeply researched stories where the real history is even more fascinating than the myth.